Um, Welcome to the last in our series of astrophysics big questions webinars for the Universe of Learning Affiliations Partnership. Today we're looking at the very exciting question of, are we alone, and how will we find life? How will we find life in the universe? So if you can advance a slide. Of course, we're all here on the line, myself, Tim, Brandon, and Erica. And Patty, has Patty joined us yet? She's on there. Ah, there you are. Yes, excellent. Oh, great background. You get to be outside. Our guest subject matter today, subject matter expert, is Dr. Robert Hurt, who is visualization specialist. Hi, Robert. From the infrared process.
We don't do that.
Just IPAC. We don't spell out the acronym, right? Okay, great.
Formerly known as,
Right. Affiliated with the Spitzer infrared mission as well. But anyway, from Pasadena, and he is going to have some things to tell us about combining both imagination and science in visualizing science information for the public. And if we advance one, Tim, our topics today are going to be
Oops,
go back.
Just trying to get that to play.
Yes, hopefully it will play, because it's a very cool animation of several real data images. I guess it's not going to.
Yeah, let me do it like this. There we go.
There we go. Yes, so on the screen are several real data images of a planet around, what is that, Beta Pictoris? Or
yes.
Yeah, so that was the direct imaging technique we talked about last week, and you see the planet actually moving over time. Today we're actually going to start talking a little bit about some resources related to finding life in the universe, and then have Robert Hurt talk, because he has an important meeting to get off to, and we wanted to make sure we got his input. And then we'll move on to talk about techniques for looking for life, and a little bit on how to use resources in your mini-funds application, and we'll talk about next steps for that. So, Tim?
Yes. So I just wanted to show off a couple of these resources. Robert's going to talk in a little more detail about some of them, but as we always like to do, we like to give you some links in here. Eyes on Exoplanets I mentioned last time, and I think I tried to show it off a little bit last time. I believe I've actually got it going a little better. Oops, share. And you guys should be seeing the Eyes on Exoplanets here. And we can jump around. We can search for something we want, anything we want on here. Nearest planet to Earth. It'll zoom us out there. And you'll actually get a little visualization, artist impression of what that planet might look like. Hypothetical visualization, as it says below. You can see the whole planetary system, which in Proxima Centauri's case is not all that much, one planet there, but you can also compare that with our own solar system, see how close that is in compared with Mercury. You can see where the habitable zone is, so you can see Proxima Centauri B is just inside of that, because that's a much smaller star than our own sun, so despite being inside the orbit of Mercury, it can be there. And you can search around for all sorts of things. If you wanted to find the Trappist system, which will be mentioned a few times today, you could go in, look for that whole system. I'm just going to pick one particular planet. But there are all sorts of gorgeous ways to really engage an audience with what's going on here. So I'm going to leave it at that, because I want to make sure we move along and go back to But please, if you have not yet, check out Eyes on Exoplanets. Figure out what you can do with it. Figure out how you might use it yourself, because there's some really, really awesome stuff in that program. TRAPPIST-1 illustrations. You can find these online. Robert's going to talk a little bit about these a little bit more. But there are all sorts of we don't have the greatest pictures of exoplanets, because the data we get is not more than a pixel. But you can check out some other ways of imagining them that can make a strong connection with your audience. We also wanted to note on the exoplanets.nasa.gov site, on the bottom there, you can see numbers of exoplanets that have been confirmed, numbers of candidates, a few other numbers on there that can be very useful. There's also, if you go to exoplanets.nasa.gov, there's a link to the New Worlds Atlas, which is basically an encyclopedia with information about all the exoplanets that have been discovered. So I'd recommend checking that out as well. Next to last thing here I'm going to show you before we give it over to Robert are the NASA travel posters. We've mentioned these before. These have been very, very popular with the public. They've been popular with other informal educators that I've known. Everybody loves these things because it gives you a sense of what might be out there. And the information found on them is based on actual science. And this is something put out by the astrobiology section within NASA. There's a series of comics. The story, this most recent one, The Story of Our Search for Life in the Universe. Actually, I think that's the title of the whole thing. No, that's this particular issue. There's 6 issues out, and you can see some actual scientists in the field illustrated within here. You can see stories of how we've looked for life, the various things, the various aspects that have gone into that. So there are a couple links that you can check out after the webinar. But with that, we will turn it over to Dr. Robert Hurt, and I believe, Robert, you can go ahead and share your screen to get those slides up there.
Okay, wait, it says someone is, I'm still viewing your screen apparently, so
oh, here, let me stop mine.
Yeah. There we go. And there's mine. So yeah, hi there. I'm Robert Hurt. I work here at Caltech at IPAC, and we work with the JPL media team and handle a lot of the exoplanet results that come through what I like to call kind of West Coast astrophysics. So we've actually done a lot of the work for the Kepler mission, the Spitzer Space Telescope, of course, and some of the Caltech research that's been on the topic. So a lot of the exoplanet art you've seen over the last few years has either come from myself or my colleague Tim Pyle, who's just at a camera shot over here, and a lot of the stories are written by Liz Landau, who's hiding back here. So we've got it's our West Coast exoplanet office at your disposal. And what I want to talk about today specifically is what goes into these visualizations you see. You know, how do we go about making art to explain exoplanets? And it's a little bit about, in general, the art of science and how we create art to explain and communicate, but also be engaging. So, of course, the science is exciting and it has really, really interesting results, but the problem is what the science produces as visual representations of exoplanets requires a lot of overhead to understand. Now, and TRAPPIST-1 is going to be a system I specifically address here because this is really like the bonanza, I think, of exoplanet search this year, when we realized, in fact, when I first was handed a copy of the paper and I looked at this graphic here and saw that that these colored dots each represented a different transit from different planets, 7 of them in one system, all around the size of Earth. We realized this is really, really something special, and that we're going to have to pull out the stops to really help people understand and really see how cool this was. So this is what you see as a scientist, and this is what you see starting up. And the significance is recognizing that each of these transits is pointing at a different object in the system, that we know what the orbits are, we know what the sizes are based on the dips, and we need to come up with a way of making a picture that tells that. Well, starting with graphics, it is sometimes not as technical and computer-oriented as this one. Sometimes I begin with very, very analog experiments and trying to understand. I dug into my marble bag and started laying things out on my carpet at home, going, okay, now how is it we can lay out a picture that will somehow like be cool and have a neat angle? And I had an idea of, I wanted to do something that basically was able to represent the range of planets in the system, what their relative distances were, but also at the same time communicate a little bit about the idea of the habitability zone. This is a recurring theme in all of the exoplanet research of, if you put an Earth-like planet at a certain range of distances from the star, there's a reasonable chance liquid water could exist on its surface, right? So part of my research involved an old iPhone case and little drops of water to see what does water look like if it's sitting on a vinyl surface when it's water, and what does it look like when it's ice? And the ultimate goal would be to produce something that looked like this. That came out amazingly close to that original iPhone photo. The elements that we have here actually represent a lot of the science in the story, but with the goal of doing it very visually and engaging. So actually, let me skip ahead for a second and just point out, like, this is actually kind of typically what we start with. And in particular, with a system with 7 planets, we actually have a lot of things to look at here. But for TRAPPIST-1, what we started with was going through the paper and just basically writing down everything we actually know from science from the paper. And this is the radius of the orbit, the period of the orbit, the radius of the planet. And in this case in particular, we had estimates of the masses of the planets due to what we called transit timing variations. Because you have so many planets that are very close to one another in more or less circular orbits, they have enough gravitational interaction with one another that actually alters slightly the timing of the orbits. And by looking at how those timing changes over time, you can actually start to deduce mass for the object. And that's cool because you can then also begin to guess what the density of the planet is. Does it have the density consistent with something rocky or something that has more gas on it? And so we basically went through and identified a lot of things that you can derive from this. In particular, the distances between the planets. And one of the things that struck me early on was, given that you're looking at a system with a star that's only a little bit bigger than Jupiter and planets that are orbiting at distances comparable to the distance of Jupiter's moons to Jupiter, what struck me was that you're actually going to be in a system where the planets are going to be very, very substantive in the skies of one another. And in particular, this magenta column I went down and said, well, if you were sitting on planet D or E or F, looking up in the sky, what is the maximum size that each of the other planets would appear as they made their nearest passes? And my jaw dropped when I realized that I was looking at numbers that saying that basically you would be seeing your neighboring planets, in many cases, looking larger than the moon looks in our sky. And so that became a very substantial thing that we really wanted to get across, this idea of proximity and scale that was going on, that you could look up and you could actually potentially, if you could stand on the surface of one and see your neighbor, you could potentially make out the surface features of your nearest planet, not your local moon. So this kind of material is then what goes into influencing what we put together when we build this out. So the things that are in this image that we're representing, we have the star is representative of the color temperature of this cool red dwarf star, which interestingly, when we actually ran the numbers and looked at it, we realized red dwarf stars actually don't look red. They're not red. Their temperatures are closer to the temperature of a low wattage tungsten filament. And even with the spectral features in the atmosphere, they come out a little more orangey, not the deep red like we classically see. So one thing that we're trying to do is make sure we always represent color accurately in these things. The scale of the orbits are represented here. We did a square root of the orbits as proportionality just so that things would fit a little better in the picture. But then we also added this element of ice crystals when you get further from the sun, liquid water as you get closer to the heat source, and then finally vapor as you get even closer, to very subtly communicate this idea of habitability zone, which isn't quite so hard-edged as it appears in our graphics, but it's getting across a little bit of the softness of that was part of the goal here. So it actually worked out well. It ended up being used for the cover of Nature, and was really helping us get some of the science across. We even, in fact, the other thing we did was make sure that even the illumination on the planets, we wanted to make that reflective of this kind of warm color temperature light coming from its star. Not a deep red, but also not white light. So just little psychological takeaways you can get from looking at this. But in a general sense, the way that we kind of approach the artistic process, I sort of summarized here, that anytime you start this kind of artwork, right, there are a small number of things that you know are true based on your observations, the diameters, the periods of the orbit. There are also a whole bunch of things you know aren't true, that it's not a gas giant, or it's how big something would be in the sky. But in addition to these things, right, there's a whole field of things that may or may not be true, plausible hypotheses, that because, especially if you have very few green checks, there are a lot of possible ways that you can build models to be consistent with what is known to be true and avoid what is known not to be true. Now, when it gets to the art process, though, I think our goal isn't necessarily to just specifically hit all the check marks, but what we're trying to do is sketch out some space in here, some region that we can say, this is what we're going to focus on. These are the known facts we're going to embrace. We'll embrace a certain set of the ideas or speculations of what might be. I like to think of the artwork as being a visual hypothesis of what's going on in the system. And you'll note that even here, I actually included a couple of X marks, things that we know to be false, because it turns out when you're doing artwork, sometimes you actually will make a choice to show something that you know is not technically true if it actually furthers other goals, for instance, goals of communication. For instance, if your message is that a planet might have a watery surface, if you suspect there's a good chance the planet may be completely covered by clouds, it may make sense to show breaks in the clouds so that you can actually see the watery surface, because then at least you can communicate the idea of water, even though the model might say that's very unlikely that you'd ever see the surface. So sometimes you do things that you know likely aren't true just to serve the greater goals of communication. So, of course, the payoff is significant, because if we were to show the TRAPPIST-1 system using only the knowledge we absolutely knew, you'd have a fairly dull-looking graphic compared to the pictures of the solar system. But then what we did is, between myself and Tim Pyle, we basically created artists' representations of each of these worlds that fit somewhere in that space of plausibility, plausible models that fit with it. And one of the interesting messages in this system in particular was the idea that having such a large planet so close to their star meant that there was a very good chance these worlds could be tidally locked, so that they would always present the same face to the sun, the same way that the moon always presents the same face to the Earth. Now, the interesting thing here is that if you have an atmosphere that is sufficiently thin and doesn't completely redistribute the heat like, say, Venus does, this could lead to very large temperature gradients from the day side to the night side of the planet. I mean, for instance, we know that there are hints of ice existing on the moon in craters that are perpetually hidden from the sun. Hints of ice may crystallize on the cool side of Mercury over time, as it rotates slowly. So getting across this idea of planets that had sort of bifurcated structures, day-night structures, became one of the core science goals that we wanted to approach. So one of the assets we created, we built an animation that just basically built a fly-through each of the planets to give you sort of a sense of the system, from the Io-inspired innermost TRAPPIST-1c, moving out to TRAPPIST-1d, B. Now this is, sorry, I can't count. This is B. C, this is C, which would be a little further out, potentially cooler but drier. TRAPPIST-1d, where the scientists speculated it could be an example of what they called an eyeball world, where there might be an annulus at some range of the temperatures where liquid water could exist. Out to the planets E and F, that at that point they were theorized they could be water-covered worlds based on their estimated densities, but with ever-encroaching ice caps from the perpetually cool side. Finally moving out to H or G, which is thought to be was thought to have the lowest density of all of the worlds and is the largest, which was thought to be a good model for perhaps a mini Neptune. Finally, to the outermost H, which was far enough out, but still with low enough potential density that it might be an ice ball. We took inspiration from Enceladus for this one. So that's basically what we have to do every time. Pick what is the best science we know, what can we visually communicate that will both engage people, but hopefully also arm them when they look at it with a little bit of information, so that they dig in to read, then they'll have a visual context to help understand what it is we're trying to explain about the system. So of course, TRAPPIST-1 generated a lot of assets because it was such a big release, one of the largest in NASA's history, actually, in terms of just web traffic and hits on social media and news coverage. There are a couple of summary sites I put down here on the Exoplanets NASA.gov site and on the Spitzer site, where we were trying to gather together sort of single places you could go and get the links to all of the different assets that were built out for it, which include a wealth of animations and videos, data plots, both still and animated. Of course, the JPL travel poster for the TRAPPIST-1 system that was really, really honing in and giving you that feeling of the magnitude and scale of planets in the sky, and even VR experiences that have been built. The JPL has a nice cardboard-enabled VR experience you can use with a cell phone and a simple cardboard holder to sort of put you on the surface and imagine one of these kind of plausible hypotheses for what the worlds might be. And then, of course, we've already heard about Eyes on Exoplanets, which is a really cool tool to go out and visually explore the exoplanet database that exists. And this is something that updates regularly, so it's always up to date with the latest of what's out there. But what we do try to do now with the collaborations that exist between the Universal Learning Partners and the various institutes that do the press releases, we try to make sure that we also release assets like surface maps when we create artwork for a planet that can be repurposed and used in planetarium software, or in the case of Eyes, we provide those same surface maps that can then be laid into the Eyes experience, so that you get a little more visual feedback when you visit the planets that's inspired by the art that was designed to go with the press release. And over time, these can be updated, and we try to keep this as updated as possible. But the ultimate goal here is just to have as much out there that you can take and use for education every time we do one of these releases. So I guess that covers my TRAPPIST-1 Dog and Pony show.
Thanks, Robert. That was great. Really, really neat stuff. And congratulations for getting on the cover of Nature. Yeah.
Got it twice this year so far. So.
Wow. So I think we know you have to go, so I want to make sure we have a chance to get questions from folks. If you have a question and want to type in the chat box for Robert, let's take a few minutes to do that.
Let's see.
Or if it's easier for somebody to unmute themselves, feel free to just ask aloud.
And I know Tim commented that TRAPPIST-1D was his favorite, and in particular, we did kind of target one to put a little extra elbow grease into to also really show off some of the more interesting things that we've never tried to show with exoplanets. That the idea that you could have a structured planet where there might be not just whether the planet's habitable or not, but a habitability zone within a planet if that planet is tidally locked. So the tools used to design, there is, so both Tim and myself use a program called Lightwave 3D, which is visual effects software. It's been used in television since the 90s onwards for things like Star Trek and Babylon 5, things like that. It's we basically use a combination of image maps that we can paint out in Photoshop, things that we can adapt from satellite views of the Earth. Sometimes we can turn to that to get imagery for cloud coverage we can put around the planets. And then within the software, it has procedural textures that are kind of fractal based that we can sort of build up layered structures that have that kind of natural look to it that will somehow kind of get at the core of what we're doing. And then the marbles, yes. Have to go to something simple. Sometimes it's just easier to throw a bunch of marbles on the carpet and play around until you get the look you like, and then you can go to the 3D software and build it out. So the names for the exoplanets actually highlight a major failing in astronomy in general, and that is we are terrible at nomenclature historically, because almost anything that has ever been named in astronomy was first named assuming it was a one-off, and suddenly it becomes a complete class of material, and then we get stuck with this way that we were first doing it. So historically, when we look at a star, the way stars were named was they were given like named by the brightness in the constellation, alpha, beta, gamma. And then sometimes if we then use telescopes and discovered, oh, that star's actually two stars, we started using letters to differentiate, Alpha Centauri A, Alpha Centauri B, and then the letters became the way to distinguish within the one name we already came up with. But then when exoplanets started getting discovered, unfortunately, that habit of using letters just kind of rolled forward, so that then if you had a star system, then you then had an exoplanet, you wouldn't use the next letter in the sequence to name the exoplanet. So if you had a star that only had one sun in it, then the first exoplanet would be the name of the star B, and the next one would be C. Unfortunately, we have star systems that have 2 or 3 suns, and so the A, B, C may all be suns, and then D might be the first exoplanet. And then, of course, exoplanets are named in the order they're discovered, which isn't necessarily the order from the star, and so the whole nomenclature gets completely scrambled and hard to follow. So at least TRAPPIST-1, the star was basically a single star, had been recently discovered in the last 20 years, and we found the planets all together more or less and could at least get the letters in order. So it was one of the neater examples.
And I think Tim may also be referring to the word TRAPPIST itself, which yeah,
because this is actually named after the telescope that was set up to look at these very, very cool, ultra-cool dwarf stars. And in fact, the only other name that exists for that star is starts with the letters 2 mass, and then a catalog number that references its location in the sky, because it turns out this class of star is actually so faint, it really wasn't cataloged in visible surveys of the sky, and it wasn't until we did an all-sky map in infrared light that we had, I think, catalog about 2 billion stars to choose from, some of which were these very, very cool ultra-dwarfs that became the catalog the TRAPPIST telescope could then draw on to look at its event. So, and then of course, this was the first really cool thing that telescope found, so it was called TRAPPIST-1.
other questions people might have?
Well, if there are any more questions, we can collect those on the Moodle, and we can forward those on to you, Robert, so that you can answer them at a later time when you don't have a meeting pressing in on you.
Absolutely.
So we'll let you go. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Great talking with everyone, and have fun with the rest of the conference.
Great, thanks, Robert. Awesome.
Thank you.
All right, so I am gonna share again where I was. You guys should see Robert Hurt's picture up there, and we will continue on. So next up, we have a question for you guys. So there has been, people have been thinking about the first evidence of life on another world in fiction for a long time. And you can see some famous books and movies and things here. But I want to ask you guys, what do you think the evidence for life will look like when we first find it? And if you could put your answer in the chat box, that would be great. So take a moment, write down in the chat box, what do you think the evidence for life will look like when we first find it? Tim is saying a bacteria or a virus on a rock. Water bears. Ooh, tardigrades. Something tiny. What other ideas? All right. Now there's an idea, something captured or crashed into Earth, worm-looking creatures, sound waves, polluted atmosphere, single cells. So we don't know for sure what it's going to look like. If we did, we didn't have to look for it. Single cell organism, excellent. So we don't know. And we're going to talk today a little bit about how we go about that search for life, what it might possibly look like, what the sorts of things we're looking for right now are. Oh, and there's a question, could we still find microorganisms on other planets, moons, bodies in our solar systems? It's possible. There is a search within our solar system. Enceladus that Robert mentioned has water under an icy crust, which might be a good zone. There's looking at Titan. Mars, I know, has had some interest for the past. Europa, right? Thank you, Brandon. Europa is another one that has some interest. So it's possible. That's just why we keep looking. I did want to mention that some of this fiction, I'm pointing off to where my screen is up there. Some of this fiction there is inspired by real science. For example, Jodie Foster's character, the protagonist in Contact there, was inspired by the work of Jill Tarter. Jill Tarter is part of the founding staff of SETI, which you might have heard of before. The Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence Institute. She was the director of the Center for SETI Research at one point. And I bring SETI up because many members of the public, when they hear life, think intelligent life. That's the first thing that pops to mind. This is why every NASA has a big press release coming is prefaced with, no, it's not aliens yet. But SETI is keeping an eye out for intelligent life by listening to listening with radio telescopes and looking in other ways. But NASA takes a different approach to it. So here you can see a graphic interpretation of what's known as the Drake equation, which is named after Frank Drake, who's another one of the founders of SETI with Jill Tarter. It was developed as a kind of conversation starter to discuss our chances of finding intelligent life. And I'm going to break this down because there's a lot going on there. NASA kind of works from the left of this equation. So first, it's trying to figure out how many stars are out there, what the rate of star formation is, and how many planets are there. So we've looked for planets with missions like Kepler. Right now, we've got a decent handle on the rate of formation of stars in the galaxy and the fraction of those stars with planetary systems. There's more work to be done, but we're getting there. But as we move a little bit further along, we're now starting to look for planets where life could exist or potential signs of life. And you can see that list of some current and past and some future missions. I think they're all current. We don't have any past ones up there. And another artist's interpretation of what another world could look like. Current missions can do a good job eliminating some places where life cannot exist. Some future missions are going to do a better job based on the details they're going to be able to find. And no, sorry, my graphics are having an issue on my computer. One sec. Oops. There we go. And so they're going to be also able to start finding potential signs of life. And we'll talk about what some of those potential signs of life are in just a moment. And we're also going to continue moving along that line and do some work starting on finding life itself. We mentioned in the last webinar some concept studies for the next decadal review. 3 of those 4 telescope proposals that are currently being worked on to be, these are 4 potential telescopes, one of which will be launched in the 2030s. 3 of the 4 of them would help us with finding life itself in some way. And it's also important to remember that conceptions change as we get new evidence through new tools. So here on the left, this is the very first exoplanet, artist impression, very first exoplanet that we ever confirmed, called 51 Pegasi b. It was found in 1995. That means 25 years ago, we hadn't even found a single exoplanet. There was some evidence that they might exist, but we hadn't had a confirmation of that. Now, we've got about over 3,500 confirmed exoplanets, and there's another 4,500 candidates for exoplanets. So there are tons out there. I think the number based on the data we've got so far is that there's an average of 1 planet for every star up there in the sky. Correct me if I'm wrong there. I'm looking at Brandon across the table from me. So our ideas change and we start to find new information. So we kind of expect this as we start looking through other ideas looking for life as well. But it's another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about the search for life is that you'll often hear the word habitability. And habitability does not equal life. It means that, yeah, it's possible that life could be there based on some of the factors about it. We haven't ruled it out, but it does not mean that life is there. So some of those factors that we consider when figuring whether a world is habitable include what's its temperature, which we figure out from the distance from the sun and how big the sun is. The size, so is that planet so big that it's got so much gravity like a Jupiter that there's no way for life as we know it to exist. And also the atmosphere. So if there is a huge atmosphere that is going to prevent life from being there because it's going to make it too hot, it's going to keep the necessary ingredients from being there, then it's not going to be habitable. If there's no atmosphere at all, which is difficult to tell in exoplanets right now, but if there's no atmosphere at all, that also would make it rather difficult for it to be a habitable planet. Yeah, and as Brandon's mentioning, their habitability is based off of what we know is required on Earth for life. We're not talking about life that we don't know. We're looking for life as we know it. If we started looking for things as we don't know it, well, we don't have any context for that. We don't know what we'd be looking for. We wouldn't recognize it when we saw it. So what are those factors out there that indicate life could actually be there? Well, one of the big ones you'll hear is water. Here at the top right, you can see Enceladus, which I hope I'm emphasizing right. Enceladus I mentioned, has water underneath that icy crust. Cassini, before its recent demise, saw water jets coming out of it, and maybe there is life there. We don't know. The search for water, follow the water, is one of NASA's mantras because life as we know it requires water. But there are other things we could look for as well. We could look for chlorofluorocarbons or other really complicated molecules. Well, they're not. Other molecules that require humans, or not humans, they require some sort of process, some sort of non-natural process. The words are difficult when you're talking about these other life things. But something that requires something to make it that's not a natural biotic process. Theoretically, if you looked at the Earth's atmosphere with a high enough resolution, you could tell that there are CFCs here, and that means some sort of intelligence was there to actually make them. But that's a visual hypothesis, Mary, of Enceladus from Cassini. There are some really good ones, but that one I don't believe is an actual picture. There are So CFCs would be one sort of indicator. We don't have the resolution at the moment. Another idea is looking for something like a combination of oxygen and methane. You can see the methane cycle down here in the lower right. You can see everybody's favorite cow producing methane. There's some termites next to it, which are one of the natural ways that a lot of methane gets produced. There's some coming off rice paddies. So there are a lot of different ways that methane can be produced. And there's some abiotic ways that methane can be produced as well. Oxygen can be produced by things that are alive. It can also be produced by things that are not alive. But the key to looking for this combination of oxygen and methane is that we don't really know a way to keep both oxygen and methane present in the atmosphere at the same time in detectable quantities, except for life. So if we found a world that had both of those going on, we'd be really excited. It'd be a pretty strong indicator that life as we know it would be there, or that there's some new physical process that we weren't aware of. There may be others as well, and we will keep thinking of how we can search for life and what those indicators might be. So, Mary, if you'd like to pull up a poll, we've got a question for you. What is the simplest form of extraterrestrial life that you would find exciting? No right or wrong answer here. It's all about your opinion.
It's filling up here. Hang on, and we have a couple more people who can reply, and then I'll show the results.
Yeah.
All right. There you are.
So it looks like about half of you out there are excited if we get to bacterial or plants. Only one of you is going to be okay if all we find are chemical signs of life. Chances are chemical signs of life is what's going to be first. And it's going to be a while before we're able to find something bacterial or plants, unless it shows up in our solar system. But you never know. Science keeps advancing. So we're going to move on to talking a little bit about how we can find some of those different signs of life, and Brandon is going to go ahead and take that over.
All right, you want to keep control?
Yeah, I'll keep
okay.
control.
All right, go ahead and go to the next slide then. Thanks, Tim. Okay, so how is it that we can see life without visiting these exoplanets? As Tim was mentioning, that if we actually tried to do direct detection of these exoplanets, with our current technology, we would not be able to map them out and see things like continents and, you know, vegetation and things like that. Maybe in the future, but not currently. So how do we do this? Well, the way to do it really is to smell the exoplanet's atmosphere. It's one way to put it. The exoplanet atmosphere can give us telltale signs of potential telltale signs of life. So what you have on the left is an artist's impression of an exoplanet as seen in front of its star. And in this case, you'll notice that it's so close to the star that its atmosphere appears to be venting off into space. And we actually see that with some exoplanets. They're too close to their star and they're actually losing their atmosphere. But if you look at the schematic on the right, you'll see an image of Hubble on the right, and then you'll see in the schematic a star with its exoplanet passing in front of the star between Hubble and the star. There's that exoplanet. And the idea is that some of that starlight is going to be blocked by the planet, and that's how we detect them in the first place. That's the transit technique. But some of that starlight is actually going to just graze the planet's surface and pass through the atmosphere before it comes to Hubble. And what you can do is you can then look at the light that has passed through that exoplanet atmosphere and look for chemical signatures of what was in that atmosphere. So as the light passes through, it will leave an imprint, if you will, of what that atmosphere was made out of. These two little plots you see on here, these are actual, these are data from, so the colored lines, if you look in the top right, are models of what we might look at or get from what we call spectroscopy, and we'll go into that in a second, but these are models of what we might get. So the blue is a model of an exoplanet atmosphere that has water in it, and the orange is a model of an exoplanet atmosphere that has water and methane. And that orange matches the green one you see in the inset image below. And the idea here is that we would be able to determine that there's methane in this exoplanet atmosphere because it looks different than just with the water by itself. Or, you know, finding water would be interesting as well. Finding both would be really interesting. What you'll notice there is there's actual real data superimposed. That's what those little black triangles are. So there is some indication that, in this case, that they found an exoplanet with methane and water. So if we will go to the next slide. So how do we do this? We take a spectrum. And so to measure a spectrum, you take the light coming from your observation and you put it through a prism or a grism or some other tool that divides up the light into its component colors. And this little schematic you see here, white light comes in, and as we all know, right, that white light is comprised of all the colors of the rainbow. So what you get out are all the colors of the rainbow, Roy G. Biv, and that works. You can, for visible light, you can do this for infrared light, any type of light. You can break it up and look at its component colors. And what you'll notice when you break it up on the top right there is you are seeing these component colors with certain colors missing, certain dark lines. And this is what you might see if you take an image or it's a spectrum of an exoplanet atmosphere. You're going to break it up into component colors, and you're going to see certain colors might be missing. And what you'll do then is you'll put that into your computer, and you'll get that plot you see below, where you imagine on the top right image, if you just drew a line across that, there are places where you have a lot of brightness, and then places where you dip down and you don't have much brightness, right? So like that black line there, that's kind of what you're seeing in the plot at the bottom. The higher points are where you have a lot of brightness in those color, and I should mention the x-axis is basically color. These are infrared colors in this case, but these are colors. And as you go across, you're going to see that the brightness dips down, where you get those dark patches. And that is basically a chemical fingerprint for what was in the atmosphere. So in this case, what you're going to see is you're going to see acetylene, hydrogen cyanide, carbon dioxide, but you could get any number of things. The chemical fingerprint that was in the atmosphere, those are going to be dips that you see in your light. And we measure this, we know where these are based off of doing spectroscopy of these materials on Earth in the lab. So we have the answer, if you will, and then we're like detectives, and we take spectra of objects in the universe, and we get these dips, and we have to match them up with where we know these things line up for different chemical species in the lab on Earth. So we do the sort of matching game. And in this case, you see the answer there. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so different patterns, different chemistry. This is actually a very difficult endeavor to do. You'll notice what I believe the top spectrum is a spectrum of the Earth. It would make sense. The bottom one is some exoplanet. And you can see that on both of them, one is methane rich and the other has a lot of water, oxygen, carbon dioxide, some methane. The idea is that when you do this in principle, it's actually quite complicated, as you could imagine, because a lot of these dips, many of these features overlap each other. And so it takes it takes really good data to do this, what we call high resolution data, where you can actually see small details, small dips. And it takes a lot of observing time. It takes big telescopes. It takes all of these things to do this so that you can actually pick out, is that dip actually due to methane, or is that dip due to oxygen or ozone or whatever it is? Okay, so go next slide. All right, I believe, oh yeah, you want to play this? So we have a short little video here to demonstrate this, what we call transit spectroscopy, this getting a spectrum of the starlight as it passes through the exoplanet atmosphere.
Here, and I can actually go show a 30-second clip that's a little bit longer, and we'll.
Yeah. And Tim is going to show a little longer clip that will. And this is another resource here that you can look at, this, where this is located, Science Visualization Studios at Goddard. So without having to play the whole thing, we'll just play it from around here. Okay, so here's the idea. You have this exoplanet passing between us and the star, and the light is absorbed and transmitted. All right, so then you see that there's different species in the atmosphere, and depending on the species, it'll absorb or transmit this light in different ways. And then you can take a spectrum and you can look at where those missing things are and then figure out what chemicals are there that cause that.
There's a lot of information in that video. It comes at you very fast. So I recommend checking it out a little bit later and taking a little bit of time to process, but it is a very nice additional resource on some of this info.
Yeah. I should mention that this idea of doing transit spectroscopy, we'll get to in a minute. We'll do a little bit more in a minute. Actually, yeah, let's go to the next slide. All right. So the pale blue dot. All right. You may be familiar with this this concept. Carl Sagan sort of coined this term. This is from the Voyager spacecraft. Yes, rest in peace, Carl. The Voyager spacecraft took this image looking back into the inner solar system while it was out in the outer solar system. And before you click the next slide, Tim, if you can see where Earth is in this image. Now those streaks are actually, this little lighted streaks you see there are actually artifacts in the Voyager telescope itself. They're not actually in space. They're sort of artifacts on the instrument. But if you see a little dot, now maybe you can see it, and then Tim will point it out for you, all right? That is how big an Earth-sized exoplanet looks, and we're still in our own solar system, right? So you can, you know, and it does have this little tint of bluish white color, but it's basically a pixel. So you can imagine the difficulty of doing these direct detections of exoplanets that are light years to tens to hundreds of light years away, right? Let's go to the next slide. All right, so a few points to leave you with. If future telescopes are going to be doing more of these direct detections of exoplanets, and the idea for those future telescopes is to be able to actually start to be able to map out very roughly surface features. That's the goal. We're talking 2030s timeframe and longer, but astronomers are starting to map out the technologies we would need to be able to do that. And once you're able to do that, like with Earth, if you were able to observe it and it was more than 1 pixel wide, you would be able to see that in the Northern Hemisphere summer, it would emit a different looking color than in the Northern Hemisphere winter because of vegetation in fall and spring and so forth. You'd be able to, over the course of an Earth year, map out continents where oceans are based off the different colors and so on. So there's a lot to be gained there. And I also wanted to mention that when we talk about the transit spectroscopy technique of sniffing exoplanet atmospheres, that has only, so the first exoplanet was confirmed in 1995. The first exoplanet atmosphere was discovered in 2005. It's 2005, Hubble did the sodium, yeah. 2005 was the sodium detection, I believe, from Hubble of an exoplanet atmosphere, the first chemical makeup. So at any rate, the early to mid 2000s, it was the exoplanet atmospheres. And so we haven't been doing this very long, and we're actually getting quite good at it. But we have a long way to go. And James Webb Space Telescope will have a big area to play here when it's launched in 2019. And this slide, why we're looking at search for life as we know it, big question mark, is just to leave you with the thought that, again, we base our searches for life as we know it based off what we know on the Earth. And the reason is because we need some parameters by which to do our search so that we can make progress. If we just throw up on our hands and say, let's think about all types of life as we don't know it, it becomes a little bit more difficult to conduct or conceive of the experiment and the telescope you would need to determine if you found it or not. And so this is why NASA takes a very step-by-step approach based off of what we do know. And as we learn more about our studies of life on Earth and in our solar system and biology in general, that also opens the door for maybe future missions to think about life as we don't know it. So leave it there.
So Mary is now going to take a moment to talk about how many of these resources might work into program models that of the sort that you hopefully will be developing. Oh. Mary, you might be muted.
I am muted. Thank you. So this has been actually, there's been a nice interaction between Bridget's, some of her comments in the chat box as she's really thinking about a program around this topic. And the about to open opportunity to propose for the mini funds to design a universe of learning program model or exhibit or event or some kind of audience engagement with the concepts we've been talking about over the past month or two. And so I just wanted to talk about a family workshop that we did in Roxbury here in Boston at a community center. And we used lots of these NASA exoplanet resources to design a day-long workshop. And so, the workshop kind of started with engaging everybody with a video intro. Then we had everybody create their own models, use their imagination. So we wanted to kind of start by getting the audience's ideas about what solar systems might be like. And of course, most of them designed something out of that was our own solar system, because a lot of audiences have not are not, avid NASA followers, although most are, but didn't know about all these discoveries of other solar systems. Still, their various designs were helped set the context for the discussion later in this workshop. We also did there's the human orrery activity that I think was mentioned a few sessions back, where it's a kinesthetic activity of people playing out planets orbiting a star. And then they did this modeling activity on the bottom image, which I think is also on the online Moodle workspace, around giving them a baggie of materials and trying to develop a model that would show how you would detect a transiting planet. And actually, I think if we move forward one, oh no, we didn't use that image, sorry. The various tables kind of imagined, they had paper towel tubes to look through. You can see one there on the slide, so that one person was the detector, and the other people were modeling the transiting planet, and they discovered lots of things that you needed, that were criteria for being able to discover that transiting exoplanet, like it had to be orbiting edge on to the place where the detector was, things like that. Anyway, the workshop continued, next slide, Tim, where we actually used microobservatory. Now, many of you are affiliates that have used microobservatory to image galaxies and nebula and life cycles of stars and things like that. But there's also an exoplanet detecting interface to microobservatory. And we, in really a 30 to 40 minute period, kids and adults together opened up images of real hot Jupiters, measured the brightness of each of those images, and the group that was about 40 people, 40 or 50 people, was able to generate the light curve that's in the upper right within 30 minutes. So it's a hot Jupiter. Actually, it's the one, I think one of our subject matter experts studied this planet. It's WASP 43. And so it's one of the targets for microobservatory. And within about 40 minutes, you can see this great big dip in those red dots that our family group discovered. And then we went and used Eyes on Exoplanet and explored WASP 43 and talked about how it was this giant planet and it was close to its sun. And they had an opportunity to make models of the Kepler telescope as well. And then we happened to have an opportunity there, because we were a face-to-face meeting, to have a live Q&A with an exoplanet research. But I want to mention that as you guys develop programs, there might be opportunities for video Q&As, as we've been doing all along in this webinar series as well. So I just wanted to kind of give you a taste of the kind of thing that program models can be. You could imagine engaging visitors over a longer time, where they themselves might create, as we did with the YCCC model, their own exhibit about some topic that you've learned about in NASA astrophysics. So this is an example of a program model. I see that I haven't looked, do I need to? Okay. Tim, if you could advance the slide. Oh, actually, before we do this, I guess I wanted to open up the conversation to questions, both about kind of in general about the fact that we're opening up the applications. And Tim, I'm actually gonna share my screen for a minute here. So I'm gonna
go right ahead.
Do that. And I'm going to show you the application. I think we posted the PDF on the Moodle, but just to remind you that, you know, we'll ask you about, of course, your contact info and what institution you're from. When you fill out the application, you want to describe a project that uses some resources that we've talked about, covering NASA Universe of Learning Science, that you can think about a way of documenting what you do so that we can share that with both the community that's been on these webinars and with others. And then what's not required but would strengthen your proposal is if you have ways to broaden participation in terms of reaching audiences that are typically underserved by science learning opportunities. And in particular, you want to kind of describe what the strengths of your institution are that you're bringing to bear on the project. In general, if it's going to be a small audience size, you'd have more success if the engagement was more in depth or over a longer period of time. But there's certainly opportunities to develop some kind of event or a model for a Astronomy Day event that uses NASA Universe of Learning funds. So there's lots of kind of variability in terms of the kinds of projects that would be successful. So essentially, you can see that the application is relatively straightforward. We know it's a small amount of funds. You describe your ideas for implementing, your audience, how you'd use the funds. And Tim, if you want to put actually, maybe I'll just put it back on here. So where are we? There we are. The application, we'll send out the URL for it later today or tomorrow. And I think next week, am I right? Do I have that yet? Let's see. Yeah, there it is. Next week, Erica and Brandon and I will be available at this same webinar time to answer questions as you start thinking about your application for mini funds and try and complete those by December 4th. So here's the timeline, so that by mid-December we'll have selected those who have successful proposals. So the question now is, are there questions? Actually, I can't find the chat box here. There it is. Yeah, if any, let's see. Yeah, Bridget, go right ahead if you have there we go. Interesting. Yeah, that seems like a discussion point for, have to post that in the forum on the Moodle, Bridget, and maybe people can give that some thought. Any other questions out there? Okay, well, maybe as you start to think, I want to really thank everyone for joining us today. Oh, what types of things are and aren't okay? Staff prep time, programming materials. Yeah, actually, that's a great question, Tim, and let me make sure the application reflects that. But staff time is good. Materials are fine, materials and supplies. if you need some funds to market the event or program, that's fine. Funds for engaging audiences, that's fine. I think we probably cannot support purchase of things like a computer or something like that. It would have to be more materials and supplies. Actually, you know what? I take that back. If you're building an exhibit or something and you need a piece of equipment and it's you're bringing lots of other things to bear on the proposal, I think we'd consider that. So let me think about that. So Tim, yes, possibly yes, especially if it's going to establish a presence in your institution for universe of learning content. But that proposal would be judged on the whole, the program model, even if you end up using the funding for a specific small part of the program model. Good question. Any others? And again, next week will be a time to ask questions as you've thought about your proposal more.
And feel free to put questions on the forum as well, and we'll answer them there in case you're not able to make it to the session next week.
Okay.
We also encourage you to feel free to talk about the sorts of things you're thinking about on the forum and talk with each other and see how you can strengthen each other's proposals. Anything we can do to help you guys out and serve your audiences better, we want to make sure we're supporting.
Great. All right. Well, we look forward to keeping in touch with you and seeing what your ideas are, and we'll see you on the Moodle and see you at next week's Q&A session, and look forward to your applications. All right.
Thank you all.
Bye.